let's start talking about digestion. But before we talk about the process of digestion, let's talk about food first of all. And what the heck is food and what constitutes food? Well, food, of course, is to give us energy, but not just energy. Human beings are made of cells, and cells are constantly living and dying, so cells are in a process of constantly regenerating, right? They're having baby cells through the process of mitosis. Your cells are dividing and dividing and dividing. Some of them are dying, and so they have to be replaced. So there's a constant building of new cells and new materials. So not just energy, but we also need building blocks. The building blocks are the molecules that are used to produce new cells and keep you going. So we need to eat for that reason too. In fact, even plants have to eat a little bit. We know that plants can make energy from the sun, right? Through their chlorophyll. So plants don't need to eat to get energy, but they sort of have to still absorb some things. They have to absorb stuff through their roots from the ground, right, in order to get the building blocks they need to produce new cells and grow as well. So even plants do have to take in some things. They're just not taking them in for the purpose of making energy. And of course, the third thing, besides building and energy, would be things that our body needs to function. So molecules that help us function. And so we'll talk about the different kinds of food and what fits into which category. But molecules that help us function, you can think about things like vitamins, right? We need to eat vitamin C, and we need vitamin D, and A, and K, and B, and all the different kinds of vitamins. These vitamins aren't for energy, but what they do is they act as sort of intermediate steps in all of the complex biological chemical reactions that are happening in our bodies to make sure that things can work. And in grade 12, you'll learn about some of those complicated reactions and maybe even where some of these vitamins play a role. But for now, we're just going to talk about the fact that they actually have to sort of do that. They mediate or help or facilitate reactions that we need to live. Minerals. We need to have some calcium in our diet because we need calcium for our bones. We need calcium in our blood to help our muscles function. Calcium is also involved in our nerve function. In fact, calcium is one of the most important minerals. We need lots of it because it does so many different things. Sodium. Even though we just talked about the circulatory system and we said that salt might be a little bit bad for you, especially if you eat too much of it, we certainly do need some. We need sodium. Your nerves require sodium to work. So you have to have some sodium. So molecules that help us function are more like the things like vitamins and minerals and things that we have to have. Oh, and of course, one other thing that we often leave out is, of course, water. In fact, when we talk, we always say food and water. But really, biologically, it's all the same thing. Water is an essential thing that we have to take into our bodies, so it forms part of our food. And believe it or not, we get a lot of our water from our food. Most food that we eat, aside from soda crackers, has a lot of moisture in it. And so a lot of that water is utilized by our body. But it's never quite enough, so we do have to drink a little bit as well. So these are the things that food is all about. So now let's talk about the molecules themselves, and let's think about which role they play. So there are basically three major classes of molecules. There are what we call carbohydrates. You commonly call them carbs. Okay, so let's talk about them first, and we'll do each class sort of in a little bit of detail. Carbohydrates. You can tell from their name. Carbo stands for carbon, and to hydrate something means to water it, right? Hydrate is H2O, water. So when you look at this, carbohydrates are molecules that are made entirely of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms only. There are no other kinds of atoms in carbohydrates, but they're very complicated. Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates come in a whole class of different sort of shapes and sizes. We'll just do a couple examples of each to give you an idea. Next year, you're going to learn a lot of them. First of all, we have what are called sugars. Sugars. Sugars in biology often end with, if you're looking for the name, they end with O's. We use suffixes and prefixes to help us identify things. So sugars are things like glucose, maltose, lactose. If you're lactose intolerant, it's because you can't digest this sugar very well. And so ending with O's, dextrose, and things like that. I'm going to show you a simple sugar. We'll draw a picture of it. And basically, it's a carbon atom attached to a carbon atom. I think I drew this before for you. Then another carbon atom up here. Then over here, there's an oxygen. He's sort of the odd one out. And then a carbon and a carbon like this. So it makes like a hexagon shape of carbons. It's a ring. And if you count those carbons, you'll see there are 6 of them. C6. Then, because carbon can hold hands 4 times, right? It has a valence of 4. Remember that from grade 9 and 10? We have to add some things. This carbon right here needs to have an H. So it has 4 hands holding on it. This one at the top holds hands with an O, which holds hands with an H. And then it holds another hand here with an H and another H over here. And then we have various distributions of, here we can have an H. And here we have an O holding hands with an H. And then right here, there might be an O holding hands with an H. And then an H over here. And then over here, an O holding hands with an H. And then an H over here. And then an O holding hands with an H here. Actually, this one, let me rephrase. Let me change that. I'll put the O down here. So this is C6, H12. If you count all the H's, there are 12 of them. And there's 6 O's in all of that. And that's the formula that we generally call glucose, right? Glucose. That's what it looks like. It's made just of C's, H's, and O's. It's a simple sugar. And it's a very important sugar because it's the one that we use primarily as our energy source in food. Okay? All right? Okay. Now, what's interesting about glucose is because this molecule is very complicated, there's many different ways you can arrange it. So, for instance, you see how I have the OH right here? Well, I could flip those around and put the OH up there and put the H down here. Or this one could be flipped. And if you flip them, you don't change the numbers. You still have the same numbers, but you have a slightly different molecule. Those are called isomers. They're molecules that have the same number of atoms, but they're arranged slightly differently. And glucose has many different isomers. So there's glucose. Isomers of glucose are things like galactose. It's the same thing, but it just is rearranged. There's another one called fructose. I'll draw that one for you because it's pretty cool. What happens there, well, I won't draw the whole thing, but in fructose, the carbon atoms are arranged with an O on top, and they're arranged in a pentagon shape instead. So there's a little carbon here, here, and here. And then there's a carbon over here. There's another carbon over here. There's H's all around it. Actually, there's an OH, I think, on one of them, and then there's a H over here. Anyway, it's just a slightly different arrangement, but it still has 6 C's, 12 H's, and 6 O's. So these are what we call simple sugars, and there's quite a few different possible arrangements. Now, the thing is that these simple sugars can also join with each other. So these OHs, if that H gets popped off, it leaves an O sort of hanging with a hand free to hold something else. And it's very easy to pop H's off. The reason is because of water, essentially. Water can, remember how water was polar? Water being polar can push and pull on other things with charge, and it can actually pull hydrogens off like this. So what it can do is it can pull off an H, and another molecule could come along and hold hands with that. And you'll learn that in grade 12 biochemistry in your biology class as well. But you can make this, watch. You can make two glucoses stick together. So I'm just going to draw short form. Short form in biochemistry, every time you see a corner, that's a carbon atom. So instead of drawing all the C's, and then we just do this, and we have some CH2OH. That's a short form for writing all that stuff on top. But I'm just going to show you. And what can happen is two glucose molecules can stick together like this. And again, this is kind of getting you ready for next year, right? This is two glucoses stuck together. So that's an interesting thing. It makes a sugar called maltose. Maltose. Malt sugar. If you have one sugar, if you have one like this, one loop, this is called a monosaccharide. Monosaccharide. The word saccharide means sugar, or is related to sugar. Over here, guess what you call it? Disaccharide. So if you're ever reading a label for food and you see these words, disaccharide, monosaccharide, you know what they are. They're sugar molecules. Some of them are stuck in twos and some are single. And these are the basic sugars. Now, what you can also do is you could keep on going. You could add another one, and another one, and another one. It's like a chain. And if you make an entire chain of sugars, the word we use in chemistry is a polymer. That means like a little chain of repeating sugars. Then what you have is a glucose attached to another glucose, attached to another glucose, attached to another glucose. And if you do this and attach 50 of them, you make a very long molecule. These long polymers of sugars are called starches. So a starch is also a form of carbohydrate. And if you stick them all together like this, it's a handy way to store them in your bodies. Plants, for instance, when they make all this glucose from photosynthesis, they stick them all together and they make various kinds of starches. Some of the starches are all in a big line. Humans make a starch out of glucose that sticks them together like this, but it also causes another sticking branch up on top, and it branches like this. These are all sugar molecules stuck together, and that starch has got a name. It's called glycogen. So if you ever see glycogen, that's human sugar storage molecule. And typically, your body will store sugar like this temporarily if it's going to be used quickly. Your muscle cells have a lot of glycogen stored up in them because they're going to use it very quickly to make energy when you move and exercise. So those are the carbohydrates, essentially. They're sugars. Okay? And therefore, energy. They are the main energy source for animals. Obviously, plants do not burn up glucose. Essentially, what we do is we take this glucose molecule and we rip it apart. And in chemistry, the bonds between atoms are energy. It's energy holding them together. And if you rip them apart, you can release the energy. So what we do is we take a glucose molecule, we rip it apart, and the energy of its holding hands is released. And instead of being holding hands to make a glucose, that energy is being used to make that ATP molecule we talked about before. And that's where the energy goes. And that's next year. You're going to learn that whole process. It's quite daunting, but also quite interesting. So the main energy source are these sugars. However, the starches, of course, are like storage. So your body makes a starch, stores it, and then when it needs it, it breaks it apart again into the individual sugars, which then can go through the process of being oxidized, right? And of course, if we remember the major overall reaction. Whoops, I put a dash in there, I don't know why. C6H12O6. And we add it to O2, and we get carbon dioxide and water. And if you're a good chemist, you'll remember that you can balance this equation by putting sixes here to make everything balanced, right? So that's the equation of energy, essentially. What's deceiving is it looks simple, but in here, there's a huge number of individual steps and processes that have to happen that you learn next year. So that's the main energy source, carbohydrates. People say if you want energy, eat carbs, right? You eat your carbs to get energy. Okay, let's talk about the next group of what happens if you want to store sugars longer. Maybe you won't need them for quite some time, but you should always have some energy stored away for a rainy day because, you might be eating this delicious gazelle that you wrestled to the ground this morning, but you might also not be able to catch a gazelle for 6 or 7 days, and your body has to rely on stored energy. And so we have what are called fats or lipids. Fats and lipids, let's say. So fats are bigger molecules that store the energy in sugar by sort of taking the glucose molecules, taking them apart a little bit, and building bigger, thicker molecules. And we've already seen an example of these fats. One of the places you find fats or lipids is in the phospholipid bilayer of membranes. So if you take a glucose molecule, it's kind of like Legos, right? Chemistry is like playing with Legos. The C's and the O's and the H's of glucose, they can be all taken apart. And you can take those pieces and you can rebuild them into a new molecule, right? And keep the energy stored in the bonds of the new molecule. And so the molecules that can be made by lipids are things that look like this. Just so you can see, I'm not expecting you to memorize all these pictures, but it is nice sometimes to just kind of see what they're made of. And remember, this part has long chains of carbon atoms all added together, and this is where most of the energy is stored. All those bonds holding hands means there's lots of energy. Sometimes there'll be a double bond. Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. I can only draw that many, but typically there might be 30 or 40 of these carbons or even more. There's quite a large number of carbon atoms. And then, I'm going to have to get a smaller line here. There's a hydrogen all the way around. I'm not even going to draw the little bond. I'm just going to draw the H's because just imagine they're bonded to them like that. And they go all like this big long chain. Remember, these are the tails of the phospholipid molecule that we talked about. Guys still with me? Okay. All right. We put a double bond O on the top. Are you with me? Focus. Okay. Then what we could do here is we could have another chain or just an H holding that hand. So I'm going to draw them with the H's here. The structure of this is that this side over here is a molecule called glycerol. And these long chains collectively are called fatty acids. They're called acids because of their chemical structure. They're weak acids, and they're not the kinds of acids you'd find in the movies that dissolve things and burn people and all of that. But they're called acids because, as you learned in grade 10, there's a whole class of chemicals in chemistry called acids, right? Some of them are kind of cool and dangerous, but some of them are rather boring and don't do much at all. Unless you're a chemist, then you're really excited about how some of these fatty acids might smell or taste like strawberries. And you could make artificial strawberry flavoring if you could make these acids in your lab, and that's kind of cool. You might be interested to know that one of these fatty acids, I think it's called butanoic acid, it is commonly secreted by your armpits, and it contributes to the BO smell. So that's kind of interesting if you're a chemist or a biologist. But these aren't the kind of acids that you would use to dissolve your victims if you're a mass murderer type thing, right? Anyway, they're called fatty acids. And together, when you put them together like this, you make what's called a molecule called a glyceride. Now, there's three kinds of glyceride because you can have three options. You can have one tail, like I drew here, or you could attach a second tail right here. And you could even attach a third tail right here. So if you have one tail, you're called a monoglyceride. Monoglyceride. If you have two tails, guess what? You're called a diglyceride. And if you have three tails, you're called a triglyceride. There you go. That's pretty easy. Now, one more thing about these tails that I have to draw to show you. Pause for a second. One more thing to tell you about. Okay, so one more thing. In the tails, I'll just draw the tails. You can have carbons holding hands like this, with H's all around, right? But it's possible for the carbons to form a double bond. So when they form a double bond, you get a C. See, here's a double bond, right? And maybe there's another, whoops, not an O, I'm going too fast. Maybe there's another double bond. So maybe there's a double bond here. When you form a double bond, that means there's less room for the H's, right? So the H's would be, this would go on here. This could only have one H, because there's four holding hands. And over here, only one H. And over here, only one H, and so on. So you have less of the hydrogens when you form double bonds with your chains. And so if you have less hydrogens, you're called unsaturated. An unsaturated fat has fatty acid chains with double or triple bonds. Double or triple bonds. If you have all single bonds, right, all single bonds, then that would mean that you have the most possible hydrogen you can get, so you're saturated. All single bonds would mean a saturated fat. You're saturated with hydrogen. That's the difference between unsaturated and saturated fats. Plants tend to make unsaturated fats, and animals tend to make more saturated fats. There's lots you can learn about these things. Saturated fats are thick and solid, like butter and lard, whereas unsaturated fats tend to be liquidy and oily, like olive oil and corn oil and vegetable oil, peanut oil, and so on. And the triple bonds and double bonds also change the shape of the molecule. And of course, shape changes the way you interact with other molecules. So it's important to know the difference between these two when you start to study how these things interact with each other in the body. We found that in terms of keeping your cholesterol levels happy, unsaturated fats tend to be better to eat than saturated fats. Of course, everything in moderation. You need a little bit of everything, but we tend to eat way too much saturated and not enough unsaturated, so we're out of balance. And that's really all there is to say about fats and lipids. So fats are for long-term storage of energy. Long-term storage of energy. And they also are for structure. Like, for instance, for example, we find them in cell membranes. Cell membranes are made of a phospholipid bilayer, which is fat, right? They are diglyceride molecules. All right. And then we have just one group of food molecules left, and that's, of course, the proteins. So we'll get to the proteins in just a minute. All right, long-term storage and structure. Okay, let's now move on to, oh wait, I got to fix my, wait, just a minute, there's a question. Okay, so that's a good point. This is sort of this doesn't apply to any of the single or double bonds specifically, it's just a statement at the end for what they're used for. Like I said, plants tend to store their energy as unsaturated fats in oils. They tend to be liquidy, whereas animals tend to store their fats in more solid form. Things like lard, butter, those are all forms of solid fats, right? And human fat is actually fairly solid. It's a little bit gooey because of our body temperature, which is so high, right? 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you warm butter up to that warm, it also gets gooey and liquidy. But at room temperature, these saturated fats tend to be solids. Okay, good. One more thing to talk about. Well, actually, a couple more things. Proteins. Proteins are not, in fact, they're very different from fats and lipids and carbohydrates. They're still made of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen, but they also contain a lot of nitrogen and even a little bit of sulfur. So now we have more atoms involved in these molecules. And we talked a little bit about proteins already. What proteins are they're also a polymer. Proteins are polymers, which means they're made of chains of littler things. The little things are called amino acids. And there's a group of chemicals that fit into this category of amino acids. There's about 20 or so that are involved in humans and in our health and what we need. Some of the amino acids our body can actually make. So we can take apart other molecules and reassemble them into the amino acids we need. But some of them we can't. We don't have the right biochemical pathways to do that. So we have to eat them. And the way, of course, you eat them is by eating protein. So when we eat meats with protein in it, or when we eat plants that have protein, beans, legumes, and things like that, we get the building blocks. We're not going to draw the whole thing. We're going to kind of just going to do a little summary here. But an amino acid is called an amino acid because it has a carbon in the middle, and it has an N with two H's on one side, and it has this little guy, which is what indicates an acid. So this is the amino part, and this is the acid part. And then on top, there's a whole bunch of other atoms stuck together in various patterns. So they all oh, and there's a little H at the bottom. They all have this bottom part, but on the top, the question mark could be all kinds of different things. That's what makes the 20 different amino acids different. Some of them have just a little CH3, or some of them have a big ring structure of carbon, and so they have all different tops. But the bottom section right here is what they all have in common. Okay? And basically, I'm just going to write AA for amino acid. And if you stick amino acids together, right, you can pop off this H right here, pop it off, and you can pop off the H's over here, and the N here can join with another acid on another amino acid sort of in the reverse orientation. And it just keeps doing that. So you can join amino acids together like this. And so you make these very long chains, and I'm talking really long, hundreds of amino acids chained together to make a chain. Okay? So put ... very long chains. Now, what's interesting about these chains, because the amino acids all have a different top on them. Remember, the key thing about biological molecules is it's all about your shape and how you push and pull on others. So, and it has to do with the repulsion of electrons in all your bonds. So when these things get together, the top parts right here, which are all different, are pushing and pulling and twisting against each other. And that causes this whole thing to take on a very weird shape. It causes this, if I just draw a green line to represent the chain of acids, all the pushing and pulling between all these little tops causes it to spiral up like this and make more of a spiral shape. So the chain becomes spirally just because of the pushing and pulling of all those different molecules on each other. And that's called the primary structure of a protein. Okay? And again, you'll probably go over this again next year. I'm just giving you some of the basics so that it sounds somewhat familiar when you get there. But then again, what happens is this spirally little twisty, turny chain of amino acids pushes and pulls even more on itself. And in particular, I'm sorry, my mistake. I went too fast. The primary structure is the chain. Just the chain. The twisty, turny part that I drew here, that's called the secondary structure. I'm sorry. Let me clear that up right now. So it's the second sort of level of structure. The first level is just the chain itself, and then when the chain twists up into a spring shape, that's the secondary structure of the protein. Okay, then what happens is, because of the sulfur atoms primarily, sulfur atoms, if they get close to each other, they'll grab on and hold hands. So what happens is every once in a while on this chain there are sulfur atoms. And that causes the little twisty chain to bend and twist when the sulfur atoms hold hands. So you end up getting a third level of structure where the spiral twists like this and turns and bends on itself. And this is caused primarily by those sulfur atoms, which are grabbing each other and holding hands. And so you get a very complicated looking blob of, it's like a long slinky that's been all crumpled up, right? And that's called the tertiary or third structure of the protein. The tertiary structure. And then what happens sometimes is you can get another chain that will come along, another blobby, messed up slinky, and it will sort of nestle into this one, and the two will sort of stick together. So you can get a complicated slinky like the green one, all twisted and turned on itself like this, and then another slinky like this blue one that's also kind of twisted and turned, nestled into the other one. And sometimes there could be more than two. There could be 2 or 3 or 4. They get very complicated. This is called the fourth structure, or the quaternary structure. Let me spell that right. Quaternary structure. Tertiary is the third structure. Okay, now I'm spelling badly again. Quaternary structure. So I'll go back and let you see that because I went pretty fast there. Let me just review it. The long chain is the primary structure. Let's go back again. The long chain, come on, which I have sort of drawn right here, just the long chain of amino acids attached to each other, primary structure. But then that twists up into a spring. So this part is the secondary structure. And there's actually another way that they can split up. They can also, instead of forming a spring shape, they can form sort of like a fan. If you take a piece of paper and you fold it like a fan back and forth, and it becomes like a pleated, it sort of turns into this shape, a pleated sheet shape. That's much harder to draw, so we'll just use this as our example. But if you take that secondary structured spiral and you then twist it into a knot, like this one, you get the tertiary structure, the knot-shaped, messed up slinky. And then if you add other ones to it, you get the quaternary structure, which is the big complicated protein. What this results in, of course, is a very large and complex molecule. A large and complex molecule that can take on many, many different shapes. It's probably infinite or close to it. Many different shapes. And these shapes are the key thing for biochemistry. The fact that this molecule can do this, and because like we're talking a molecule now that has hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of atoms in it. It's very, very big. Not like C6H12O6 with 24 little atoms. These are gigantor molecules. And they're so complex. And they can take on so many different shapes, which means they can perform many different jobs. So they're very important in biological settings. So what proteins do is I'm going to write them sort of down here. The first number one job that they do is they form enzymes. And enzymes are catalysts. But we call them enzymes in biology because they're a special kind of catalysts. And what an enzyme does is it uses its interesting shape and the fact that it has all these electrons and bonds, which means it can attract and hold on to different molecules in different ways. So I'll just give you a very, very brief rundown of how that could work. You can imagine a twisty, spiraled up protein like this, and it might have a little dent in it at the top or something like this, right? And so what can happen is a little glucose molecule might come along and it might find that it can stick right there. And another one might come along and find that it can stick right there because of the way that the shape is just right. It fits right in there. And the electrons that are pushing and pulling kind of guide it and hold it into that place. And while they're being stuck there, then it's very easy to pop off the H's and form a bond and link them together. So this would be a reaction where you could take two glucose molecules and stick them together to make a maltose molecule. And that's how it catalyzes the reaction. It helps by bringing the molecules together and also bending and twisting them in just the right way so that they can link together far, far simpler than if they were just left on their own to do it. If you had to wait for these two glucose to join in a big giant soup of molecules, it would take forever just for them to meet. But if they happen to be carried around by a protein enzyme, they can enable reactions, and not only enable them, but speed them up and make them happen thousands of times faster than if you were just waiting for them to mix. They speed up reactions. So, just about every biological reaction, I'm going to go out on a limb and say every single one, every single reaction that happens in your body, there's an enzyme that helps it. There's that many different enzymes, and there's hundreds of thousands of reactions, right? So that's one of the main roles that they play. But that's not all they do. Proteins also form structures. So the second thing that proteins do is they form structural components for building parts of cells. They form part of membranes, right? We've seen that proteins can be in a membrane and function as a gate. So they have all those functions as well. Structural components, I'm going to put, and gateways in membranes because that's a very important thing that they do. A lot of the chemical reactions in your body involve a membrane. In fact, when you burn glucose, to get the most out of it, you need a membrane in the mitochondria, and that membrane has proteins that are pushing and pulling things through, and that helps extract even more energy out of the glucose molecule, as you'll see next year. And then the third thing, of course, is that they can serve as messenger molecules. What we often call hormones. Molecules that can be released by glands in your body and circulate through the body and interact with cell membranes and cause changes and things to happen, right? So proteins can often form or act as messenger molecules and hormones. So they're very, very complex, and they're the most versatile molecules of biology. And they're humongous, right? They're humongous. So if you draw them to scale, when I drew this glucose up here, that's probably too big. When you look at this big blue protein, a glucose molecule is probably only about that big. Very, very small. And so these are giant molecules with multiple different shapes that can do many different things. All right. One of the things, of course, that we associate proteins with is muscle. And that's because muscle cells do have a lot of proteins in them. They have proteins called actin and myosin, which enable them to do their job. But proteins are found everywhere, not just in muscles. And of course, we know this because plants have protein too, and plants don't have muscles. So it's not just muscles, but we do get a lot of our protein intake from eating meats, but also we can get it from vegetables and things as well. Those are the main food components. But there is one more thing to consider, and that is the vitamins and minerals that we eat. So let's just talk about vitamins first. Vitamins are molecules that facilitate, let's spell that right, reactions. So what that means is they might serve as an intermediary. A particular molecule might require a vitamin precursor in order to sort of be the basic building block to build that molecule. The vitamin might function in a way that helps a particular process happen. We know that vitamin A is a necessary part of the chemical processes that involve vision. So we know that vitamin A is important for seeing because the chemical processes in your retina need vitamin A to function. We know that vitamin D is very important in regulating calcium in your body. We know that vitamin D also is very important in helping your immune system function. Vitamin C is also thought to be important in helping your immune system function. And so vitamins are molecules, and they come in all different shapes and sizes, but they're usually relatively small. They'd be, on the same scale as glucose and maybe a little bit bigger, maybe 4 or 5 glucoses big type thing. And there's lots of them. And we call them different letters, of course. There's vitamin A. There's a whole bunch of B vitamins. The B vitamins, I'm going to put the Bs because there's B12 and B6 and all the different ones that are all related. There's vitamin C, there's a vitamin D, and there's a vitamin E, and there's a vitamin K. Don't confuse vitamin K with potassium, which are both a K. Vitamin K, well, actually, vitamin K, I think, is potassium, or it's based on potassium. So maybe that's the same thing. It's almost a mineral. I'll have to look that one up. I'm not sure about that. Vitamin K. There's a reason why they didn't call it vitamin F. They called it vitamin K, and I think it's because it's essentially just potassium. But nonetheless, these are all different, and there's several of them. There's probably, if you look at the vitamins on your cereal box or on a food label, you'll see that there's actually quite a few of them. And they all have different roles and play important roles. Now, the trick about vitamins, though, is that we need small amounts of them. A lot of people are mistaken in thinking that if a little bit of vitamin A is good for you, then a lot of it must be better for you. But the truth is your body does not like a lot either. Your body doesn't like too little vitamin A, but it also doesn't like a lot. It likes just the right amount. Your body wants a balance. And so it's not always true that, you should eat 6,000 carrots a day because that's better than eating 2 carrots at your Sunday dinner. What we want to maintain are levels of vitamins that are within the norm. But often we start talking about foods and we say, oh, this is a superfood because it's packed with vitamins. And if you eat more of this kale, or the latest one I saw was, what was it, watercress or something. It's packed with vitamins. But that doesn't mean you just eat watercress for your whole meal. That's going too extreme. We need small amounts of these vitamins, and as long as we have the small amounts, we function perfectly. Right? We function as best as we can. You don't function better by eating more of the vitamin necessarily. You just need enough, and then it's as good as it gets. So if you want vitamin D, you need so much. Eating more of it doesn't make it better. It's probably going to get broken down by your liver and the remnants are going to be excreted in your urine. So you have to be careful when you're taking vitamins that you're taking them in the right amounts and not overdoing it, because you're just basically wasting your money. And also, some vitamins can become toxic. Like vitamin D, for instance, can become toxic if you have too much of it. So you have to be careful that you're not just going crazy and thinking, well, if some is good, more is better. That's not the way biology works. But it is the way fad diets work. So you have to be careful when you're listening to people on YouTube or influencers who are telling you what to eat. Generally, 17-year-old blonde girls with no education don't know as much as PhD researchers who have been studying metabolism for their entire lives, right? But ironically, no one listens to those on YouTube. You ever see a YouTube channel with a PhD biochemist? No. It's always a 16-year-old girl with no education telling you what you should do. It's weird how our society works. Lastly, minerals. Minerals are things like sodium and potassium. So potassium is kind of like a vitamin/mineral. Sodium, potassium, calcium, right? And when we talk about minerals, we don't mean that we want the ion forms. You know how metals can form ions, right? So it's potassium. These are ions that are dissolved in our blood. So they were once joined to something, and when they get into the water, they fall apart and they float around as ions. Sodium, potassium, magnesium is another one that's important, an important ion to have. We also refer to these sometimes as electrolytes, right? When you drink your Gatorade to get more electrolytes, there's, again, this idea that you need these, so you should have more. The truth is, when you're in sports, Gatorade isn't necessary. Water is what you need at the moment. Your body will get all of these from the food that you eat. But people have marketed these sports drinks to say, oh, look at this. You can get all this back because it's going out in your sweat, right? Your salty sweat. You're losing sodium. You need to put it back in. Not really. I mean, yeah, if you sweat for 14 days straight and never ate a thing, your electrolytes would become low. But if you go out and play a game of soccer, your electrolytes are just fine because you probably ate breakfast, you might have had lunch, and you're going to eat supper, so you're going to replenish everything. I'm just looking to see if, there's another one. Strontium is another one. I think it's strontium is 2+, eh? Can't see the periodic table from here, but I think it's in the second column. There's many. Iron, obviously, is another important one that we need. Remember, iron is in our hemoglobin, right? In our bloodstream, so we need iron. Plants use magnesium in their chlorophyll. That's very important for them. And there's a whole bunch. I'll put ... here or write etc. There's lots of minerals that we need. But again, we need only tiny amounts. And more is not necessarily better. Zinc is another one we should add. Zinc has been shown to be another immune system mineral that helps with the immune system. But the point is it's tiny amounts. Eating more of them doesn't necessarily make it better. You just have to maintain the appropriate levels. And then lastly, we have our last sort of thing we mentioned was water. And it's pretty self-evident why water is important. Humans are about 70 to 80% water. When you look at us, we're sloshy things inside. That's humans. And so water is very important because it forms the solvent in which all of our chemical reactions take place. And in fact, what's cool about water, you'll learn this next year, is that its polar nature actually enables reactions to happen. They wouldn't happen otherwise. Now, when I say all chemical reactions, I should say all biological, because we're talking about living things. Biological chemical reactions happen. That's as humans, yeah. Solvent in which all the biological chemical reactions happen. And not just the solvent, but it also enables reactions. Without water, the reactions wouldn't happen. And that's important. And it has to do with the fact that water, being polar, can push and pull on other molecules. And it can pop off hydrogen atoms and open up the atoms to have new bonds. It's strong enough to do that, the polarity of water. So that's very important too. And of course, we know that we need water. You can live for many, many days without food of any kind because of the storages you have, fats and glycogen that can be used. And in fact, if you run out of that, your body will even disassemble your proteins to make energy. It'll eat your muscles. But that's in extreme starvation situations. But water, a couple of days without water and you're in dire straits. You'll probably end up dead within a few days. So if you're ever lost in the bush, water is going to be the main thing. It's going to probably do you in before not eating. You can go for weeks without food. You might feel hungry, but water is critical. And that's, of course, because our bodies lose so much water. We lose it through our sweat. We use it to keep cool. We don't just lose it. We use water as sweat because it's so important for us to stay cool. Evaporation from our skin. We need that. It's not wasted. It's important. We use water to eliminate waste from our bodies. When you urinate, right, that's a lot of water that's being wasted. Think about all the fluids that you make in your body. Think of saliva. Think of the juices that go into your stomach, the gastric juices, the acid. Think of your pancreas making bicarbonate solution. All bile made by the liver to go into digestion. A lot of water goes into the processes of making things happen. So we have to replenish it almost constantly. So those are the nutrients of life.